Here's what I want. I'm going to be recording everybody, just so you're aware. Okay. The very first forms of graphic design, the very first were of written communication, of how people were communicating to others graphically, were found in Lascaux, France, the first cave paintings, 50,000 years ago. The drawings were on substrate, stones, clay tablets, animal skins, leathers, leaves, papyrus, wood, and bamboo, ivory, and wax. What did they draw? Well, they drew simple images of animals, probably referring to hunting, where the herds would be, communicating what they were following. They were referred to as pictographs, concrete representations of objects that were physical. Some scholars say they were the first paintings or the first attempt at graphic communication. They could have been hunting instructions. We really don't know what they were. The other things that were found were simple lines to indicate quantities, arrows for directions, complex scenes and figures to record hunting territories, ideogram or primal pictograph writing systems. They're not connected to spoken language. A few years back, I traveled to Ireland. I have a cousin and her husband who live in Ireland. He is a professor at Cork University. Here's a picture of Cork University. And inside those arches, he invited me to come see the Ogham stones that they have a collection on display, permanent collection at Cork University. And this is an example of early alphabets and early communication. So in the building I just showed you a picture of, this is on the inside. These are, well, these are open to the outside, but in these hallways, they have the display of the stones. So in this picture is my son when he was 12, 13, 12. I think he was 12. He was about my height at this point. So he was about 5'5". These stones are, if you look at this one way in the back, you can see that it's probably like as high as 8 feet tall. But a lot of them are 4 feet and up, just about. And so they're massive. I mean, obviously these things are not something you're carrying around with you. They're pretty big and they're not going anywhere. And so the way that the ancient writings were done is, you see each stone had a stem line running through it. And you see these notches that are sometimes to the left, and here they're sometimes to the right. Here they're to the right. Sometimes they're right on the stem line. And so, and then you'll see down another stem line, there's more notches. And so these lines and dashes were used to communicate. And so they called it an Ogham alphabet, and it uses a series of 20 characters arranged in 4 groups of 5, with each character made up of between 1 and 5 scored lines or notches. These are, like I said, they're to the left or the right of the stem line. So they've actually deciphered the code. And so the vertical lines here are the stem line of the stone. And so however many notches are to the right, they've determined like that would be an N. If there were, 5 notches to the right, it's an N. If there were 4 to the right, it's an S. If it's 3, it's a V, 2, it's an L, 1, it's a B, and so on and so forth. And so they've kind of cracked the code of what these notches in the stem lines refer to. And what they are is they're stones that bear the oldest Oghams, are really names of people being commemorated using a standard style or formula, such as son of Y or ex-son of Y, descendant of the tribe Z. With only one known exception found in Wales, the names are all of men. They're all men. Apparently there's one woman, The rest are all men. And there are about 380 Ogham inscriptions written in the Irish language. And about 330 are in Ireland and about 50 in Wales. So these are all between Wales and Ireland. And it's just another example of these primal pictogram languages that, you know, have been around well before our Western alphabet ever came to be. And Ireland being a country that uses a Western alphabet now. And so these more pictorial iconography, if you think about in Mesopotamia, 3100, 2800 BC, these clay tablets were found. And here you can see that we're really starting to see a grid system in place. So, right, you can see a grid and you can see there are icons and information in each quadrant of the grid. And then I also want you to notice that there's little indentations. See these like dark shadow areas? This is where someone took their thumb or finger and indented the soft clay. So they drew the picture, they drew the grid, then they're counting and they're putting an indentation in the corner. And it's basically, think of this as a way to keep track of basically record keeping, right? And they were using their hands and their actual digits. You know, we think of our fingers as digits. They were indenting the clay with their fingers. And so we count with our fingers. And so they were counting. And so they were counting with their fingers as digits. So fingers are digits, digits are numbers, and computers are digital. This is what we're all on now. So where do these all lead us? But these are things we still use today, grids and organizing, iconography. Think of the new, like these are like the early emojis. I think of all of this like, okay, we're going back in our world today to emojis. I mean, look at where we started. Here's cuneiforms, 3000 BC. They're referred to as cuneiforms, meaning wedge shaped. So they're really dependent on they're driven by the tools they were used to draw them. In this time frame, they were thousands of pictographs were consolidated down to 560. So in order to communicate, you had to remember, you know, we only have 26 letters. They had to go with 560 symbols to communicate. And imagine how hard that would be with like 560 symbols to read or write. And so obviously it was a very select few that could actually communicate in this form of communication. But I look at this now and it just reminds me of, you know, we're using emojis more and more in our communication. And it's almost like we're going, I don't know how many emojis are in the world. Does anyone know how many emojis? We'll have to look up how many emojis are out in the world, because I feel like we're heading back to the cuneiform. Oops. So the development of the cuneiform. So hieroglyphics in Egypt, 1450 BC. The hieroglyphics are stylized pictographs, you know, again, the emojis of the day. They're formulating ideas. Their combinations are referred to as ideographs. Approximately 700 hieroglyphs were used in Egypt to communicate. And so their language was all done again with, you know, their version of emojis. They had 700 of them to work through. All right. Now, anyone know the Rosetta Stone? Is anyone familiar with ever seen this before or heard of the Rosetta Stone? Does anyone know where this lives? This like birth cradle of alphabets and language. Where does this live? It's from Egypt.
I'm
right?
not sure, but isn't it like super religious? Like the Rosetta Stone was like the whole, I don't know, what's called the History Channel. Too much bad exposure to the History Channel.
Well, it has the 3 different languages on it. So it's really kind of a one source for like seeing the kind of cradle of alphabets, you know, the 3 different examples. Like most of Egypt's, any fans of Indiana Jones? Who did Indiana Jones work for? Does anyone remember those old movies? The British Museum.
Oh, I was going to say he was a professor.
Yeah.
I knew
He
it was
was
a museum. but
Yeah.
didn't know which one.
Yep, he worked for the British Museum. And so the British Museum, has a lot of the Egyptian artifacts. But here in Milwaukee, how many of you have been to over in Milwaukee to the Milwaukee Public Museum? We have a replica, I'm trying to think of the word, a replica of the Rosetta Stone at our public museum. And we have an amazing Egypt exhibit, and it has the Rosetta Stone in it. And just a fun fact for all of you, my Illinois friends, is that the Milwaukee Public Museum was designed and built before the Field Museum. And the same designer who built and designed the Milwaukee Public Museum and the exhibits at the Milwaukee Public Museum went on to design the Field Museum. So there's a connection for you of our two history museums. But we have a replica here, so you can kind of get a feel for the scale of the Rosetta Stone. The reason we show it is because we're really kind of talking about the development of the alphabet and where it all goes. Now, this map, of course, is not a map of today. This is a map of where we were in 3,000 years ago. So we have the cradle of the alphabet, the Middle East region 3,000 years ago. The Sumerian cuneiform script and early Semitic alphabet was born. And so here's a little easier map to look at, a word map. So we start with the early Semitic alphabet down here at the bottom. And if we look at the black type, this is the direction we're taking for the Western alphabet, the Western Latin alphabet. So we start with early Semitic, we move to Northern Semitic, to Phoenician, those are our Egyptian, and then we go into the Greek, Etruscan, early Latin, and Classic Latin. That's how we get our alphabet that we use today. But I want to also point out that it all started with the early Semitic, and then it went different ways, right? You go Southern Semitic, you get all of your languages are derived, but they all start in the same place or very similar places, but then have all of these branches. So let's go into the Phoenicians, 1500 to 1000 BC, a phenomenal consolidation of letter forms was accomplished by the Phoenicians around 1000 BC, representing huge progress in of processing and delivering information. In contrast to all those cuneiforms and hieroglyphs, hundreds and hundreds of symbols that people had to remember, all of a sudden the Phoenicians, as brilliant as they were, they got this down to 22 symbols. And this was necessary because the Phoenicians, like everyone you're going to learn from here on out, what did they want to do? Rule the world. They were all about ruling the world, and they wanted to trade and in order to do that and to connect with all of these other countries and empires, there had to be a way to communicate. And so they needed some sort of communication tools. So all that trading was happening. The Phoenicians created that first alphabet. It had 22 consonants, and it was written from left to right. They were spreading this alphabet around, as you saw the path, back here. There's the path. Here's the path. They go to the Greeks, and the Greeks adopt this Phoenician alphabet, changing and making it their own. So they changed 5 consonants to vowels, which we now know as A, E, I, O, and U. Sometimes Greek writing started from left to right, and then the next line returned to right to left. And then they went left to right to left, and then they would start flipping letters depending on which way they were going. Super easy to read, right? Not confusing at all. So, finally, they got to a point where it was kind of like a little chaotic. It kept spreading because they were, empires were happening, wars were happening, people were trying to rule the world. And the communication was, starting to grow. And eventually the Greeks realized, this kind of going zigzagging back and forth and flipping our letters, isn't that efficient? Isn't making that much sense to everybody. So let's just figure out one way to do it. And they decided to go left to right, as we do today. So the Greeks we can thank for figuring it out and realizing, oh yeah, zigzagging isn't so easy. It's good for when you're, going down a mountain in your car, but not so much when you're reading. So the history of writing demonstrates that it was arbitrary, but today it simply might just be what we ended up seeing. So the Greek military conquests and the commercial expansion demanded keeping track of information. And so the Greek civilization is credited with the first collection of written documentation and libraries. So we can thank the Greeks for our libraries. And then the Romans conquered the Greeks and adopted their alphabet, as they adopted most of Greek culture. So again, now the Romans are in charge and they're ruling the world. And so the Roman alphabet was also influenced by the Etruscans living throughout Italy at the time. The Etruscan alphabet had the same number of 26 letter forms that we have today. And the Romans changed the naming of the alphabet symbols from the Greek alpha, beta, gamma to the individual characters we know as A, B, C, D, etc. So this alphabet here looks pretty familiar, don't you think? All of a sudden, the letter forms are like, wow, these are what we're used to seeing. When we come to Trajan column. And so anyone heard of Trajan's column? Are you familiar with this? Has heard of this maybe in a history class? Any history buffs here? So the Roman letter forms are inscribed on ancient monuments and architecture. These inscriptions are purposeful testament to the beauty and enduring power of the written word. They literally are monumental letter forms. So they're giant, they're carved, they're chiseled into stone. So they are now the precursor of what we call capital letters, right? They were called monumentals, capitals, or capital letters that we refer to them today. Although attempts have been made to tamper with letter form designs that condense them or expand them to equalize their varying widths, or to electronically change their proportions, the consequences have not replaced the design principles set by the Romans and affirmed by their successors. They have become the quintessential melding of art and information. And so here is a much bigger example of an image of Trajan's column and the letter forms that have been carved into stone, monumental capitals. And so does this look familiar? Look at this typeface closely. Look at it very closely. Does this seem familiar to you? Do you think you've seen this somewhere before?
Times New Roman?
No. I'm going to give you a hint. It goes by the name Trajan. Let me share with you how familiar this typeface is to you. You might not even realize how that down. Oh, hold on. This is what I want to hit. Is it letting me hit it? There we go. Right. Are you guys seeing my whole screen now?
Yeah, I can see.
Safer streets. Cavalier Johnson is adding 200
Sorry,
new homes
you have to get
this
through
year.
the
Taking
ad
action for a
so you can
safer
play my
Milwaukee.
video.
Mayor Cavalier Johnson.
Come on, come on.
If you're sitting in a movie theater during previews and you see this, you know to expect a comedy movie. If you see this, you know it's going to be action. Make the letters a little skinny, and boom, it's sci-fi. You know this one's going to have fast cars, this one's going to have Michael Cera, and this one is going to be a rom-com. You don't even need the music to know it. But what about this? This typeface, Trajan, is probably one of the most popular movie poster fonts ever. You can see it in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Double Jeopardy, Letters from Iwo Jima, Titanic, Teen Titans. It's everywhere. So how did it get there?
I'm Yves Peters. I'm a graphic designer who has been writing professionally about type and typography since about 10 years.
Yves has looked at a lot of posters, and a few years ago, he started to notice a trend.
So I started clicking. I didn't know where I started because I ended up looking at about 16,000 posters. Yeah, well, I look at about 100 posters per month, and I've been doing this series since 2006. It's a lot of posters every year. Yeah.
He noticed that the use of Trajan rose significantly in the last couple of decades. But why? In 1989, designer Trajan's column into a digital typeface. It was made for Adobe, so it was a part of the software that a lot of people were starting to use to make posters. A couple years later, it made its movie poster debut here for Hector Babenco's At Play in the Fields of the Lord. After that, it was on The Bodyguard and Scent of a Woman. Then it was on 3 1993 box office hits. By 1994, it was everywhere.
It's originally used for epic movies, movies about people that overcome difficulties, like big war epics and so on. But then you see gradually that it becomes the standard movie font. It's like the Arial of movie posters. So people need to turn out a poster really quickly and just pick Trajan.
Eventually, that overuse started to change the kinds of movies that would use the typeface.
You don't see it as much on the big productions anymore. It's become the typeface of the horror movies, the B movies, and also the straight-to-video ones. So you see that a lot of posters are for the lesser movies that want to pretend they are better than they actually are.
The rise and fall of Trajan illustrates the downside of digital typeface. The convenience of swapping fonts is a huge shift from the old movie poster days when hand-painted typefaces, or lettering, was an art that was specific to each movie.
So what you see behind me, this is more like the pre-blockbuster thing. Pre-genres, pre-standard styles. And that's why you will be hard-pressed to find two that are similar.
That doesn't make today's genre-specific typography bad design. These visual cliches make it possible to communicate tone and plot details to an audience incredibly efficiently, and there's a certain art to that.
People get nostalgic about the old era of movie posters when everything was still done by hand and still very unique, but you could compare it to music, where some people say, oh, nothing good was produced since the Beatles. But then there's other people say that nothing good was produced since Mozart. Fair enough, but there's many other interesting things that are being produced now. There's just much more, but there's still a lot of very good poster design happening. It's just you need to know where to look.
Right. What do you think? Familiar?
Now it looks familiar.
You've seen it. You don't know it, but you've seen it. So yes, so here, just to give you context though, recognizing that yes, Trajan is probably the oldest typeface based on the oldest typeface in existent Roman typeface, right? Latin typeface. So just to give you an idea of like how crazy popular it is today yet. I mean, it's had its rise and its fall, but you know, it's still around. So basically, what we're at a point now is where everything is capital letter forms, right? Everything is capital letter forms, and Trajan is as well. It's only capital letter forms when you use the typeface on Adobe fonts. So you can find it and look at it. It's all Adobe. It's all capitals. So we're at a point where they call it majuscules are capitals, and the capitals are kind of not when they're not chiseled in stone. So where are we at? Yeah, here we go. So when we're not chiseled in stone, we're looking at more of an upright script. So when we can get a little more casual, when we're not having to, we can have a little more curves and roundness when we're dealing with ink on parchment instead of the chiseled in stone. They move into square capitals, and this is around 100 to 400 AD. Another example is how this change tools and materials are provoking change in the letter form. So we have the ability to be a little more casual because we're not trying to chisel. And we're looking at now, how can we condense our letter forms to get more on a page? Because we're using parchment. Well, parchment is made with sheepskin. So a 200-page manuscript represented 4 or 5 months for a scribe to hand letter onto 25 sheepskins. This was an expensive process. It was time consuming, labor consuming. A lot of sheep lost their lives for it. So we needed to try to get as much on the page. And so they recognized the need to condense the faces and fit more on a page. And so that kept addressing the need. Speed was the other issue. And so Roman cursive came about. So this is for fast cursive majuscule script for notes. This is really for note taking, maybe in the book margin or when they're giving feedback as they're designing and developing things. They needed a way to communicate quickly and definitely not taking the amount of time that the scribes were doing. So you can notice though, this is the first time we're seeing, of course, we can't understand this at all, but I want you to notice that there's lines that are going above the baseline and below the baseline, much like we have ascenders and descenders doing that today. So there's kind of like the first hints at lowercase and ascenders and descenders. So then we get to the 4th century. We're still using Roman lettering, and we've started this new variation called unical. And the proliferation of manuscript writing, the business of books was, in high gear. More and more books were being made. However, it's still by hand, still by scribes, and they needed to get quicker because this was taking months and months and months, and they needed to get quicker. They needed to draw these letters faster. And so this was their solution, fewer strokes. So if you look at the capital letter E, a traditional letter E was a vertical line, stroke and 3 cross strokes. The unical has 1 curved stroke and 1 cross stroke, saving time. And you can see there's a lot less fussiness going on with these letters. They're much quicker, simpler to basically work, get more accomplished in a quicker fashion. So the first book that used this typeface design is the Book of Kells in Ireland, 800 AD. So we're dealing with we're in the Dark Ages. It's the collapse of the Roman Empire. And again, we're all dealing with, who's going to rule the world now. Ireland was spared the barbarian invasions during those medieval eras because it's just such a hard place to conquer. Ireland didn't get conquered. And as a result, their libraries and their books and their manuscripts survived, where in many other places around Europe, they did not. They were all burned to the ground. So basically, all the books were being written in monasteries by scribes who were production letterers. And then you would have like an art director and an editor, and you'd have someone that'd come in and start adding the gold leaf. And you'd have someone else that would come in and start adding the illustration. So here's a page from the Book of Kells in Ireland, 700 AD. And you can see how much simpler the lines are and how you kind of start almost seeing, it feels like almost like a lowercase vibe to it. It's still only, it is considered still uppercase, but we start seeing ascenders and descenders. It's a 2-line scaffolding, unlike what we use today, which is 3 lines. But, it's starting to get simpler. Anyone been to Dublin and Trinity University and seen the Book of Kells? Oh, I thought I had one more slide. Seen the Book of Kells? They turn 1 page a day, and you can go and stand in line and see them turn a page. Has anyone done that?
I was there in May 2019.
Ah, excellent. So you saw the book?
Yeah, it was really cool.
Awesome.
I didn't know what it was until I went there. My friend is just hardcore Irish pride, and that's something that she really wanted to do. So we went and did that.
Awesome. Yeah, this is something the Irish are very proud of. Absolutely. I've gone to Ireland a few times, as you saw from my earlier pictures. I have been there. I have not, I hate to say, seen the Book of Kells because I'm always traveling with my family and no one is willing to wait in line with me to see them, a book. I don't know why. It's crazy, but every time I go, no one will stay in line with me. So I've been to Dublin a couple times and I have not yet seen the Book of Kells. So my next trip, I assure you, I will see the Book of Kells live and in person. So I can say I've done that. But it's sad but true. I've walked past Trinity University multiple times and never gotten in line. Okay, so we're dealing with half unicles are kind of the way of the future. This is the futuristic design of typography. We are getting ascenders and descenders. Now in the 6th century, the body of the letter form was drawn to what was now referred to as the X height. We refer to the X height, which is this line between the baseline and the mean line is the X height. And it's proportioned as 1/2 the height of the Roman square capital. So we're making progress. 1996, Adobe Fonts created a digital version of minuscules and minuscules, and they named the typeface Philosophia. And Philosophia is really kind of showing you that design of the, pseudo similar of that kind of this majuscules and minuscules, kind of early days, kind of some of the capitals look like lowercase and so on and so forth. So, so here's an example of it in use. And then we move into the Carolingian minuscules, 8th century to 10th century AD. Charlemagne became the emperor of the Central Europe. Similar to the business plans of the Phoenicians, he wanted to rule the world. And so he decided in order to rule the world, he needed to consolidate a writing system for the use of his government. Regional script styles were multiplying and crippling widespread communication. If everyone has their own way and no one understands each other, then obviously you can't take over the world. So in order to take over the world, he ordered that there was a standardization of lowercase half unicole letter forms called Carolingian minuscules. The Carolingian minuscules are essentially lowercase letter forms that we have today. The Carolingians used the Roman capitals for their headlines and initial caps. So by now, year 800 AD, we finally have a writing system that combines uppercase and lowercase letters. And here it is. It's a first example. You could easily see that this is, you can clearly see uppercase and lowercase letters right here. So the Gothic manuscript using uppercase and lowercase letter forms, it's also using a grid, 2-column grid. We also have margins and the dominant writing style of the Gothic period. So all of a sudden we're having 2-column grid. Up to now, when you saw a book, all the type would be in 1 column. So this is another big introduction, a 2-column grid system. So then building on that, we have texture and minuscules, 13th century AD. Like the Roman capitals, these letter forms are condensed, saving on space. Parchment is not cheap. So the idea of how much can we get on a page? And so moving towards the ability to mass produce. So here's an example of the first page of Genesis in Gutenberg's 42-line Bible, 1450 to 1455. This is Gutenberg chose the square compact textura lettering style, commonly used by German scribes at the time. The technique proficiency of his printing rivaled the hand lettering expertise of the scribes, and Here's an example of the very first printed book in using the Western Latin alphabet. Now, it's not to say that printing was first developed in Germany. It was not. China was credited with printing about 400 years ahead of this. But this is the first Western Latin alphabet printed book. And here's an example of the tools that were used. In the years beyond 800, parchment was being replaced by the invention and availability of paper. Wooden blocks of the type stamps were being replaced with letter forms cast in steel, and the increased demand for books, including the growth of universities, moved book craft from the monastery to production facilities of metalworking and engraving. And Johann Gutenberg was a metalworker and a cast movable type for printing press around 1450. And here's an example of what lead type looks like. And the first printing press to appear outside of Germany in Europe was in Italy. And this was happening during the Renaissance, and the humanist philosophy of the Italian Renaissance fostered a renewed interest in Roman literature. The first Roman type style, called humanistic, is a combination of Carolingian minuscules and monumental Roman capitals, and it was designed over 500 years ago. This 15th century humanistic book type is remarkably familiar to our eyes today, what we might identify as the typeface Garamond. All right, and that's where we're going to pause. Any questions? What did you think about? We just went through 50,000 years of history of the alphabet, and you can see that we've been using the alphabet we use today for quite a long time. And not only the alphabet we use today, but the design of the letter forms that we use. So let's take a break. That's a lot. I want you to, get some little stretching exercises in. It's about 7:49. Let's come back at 8 o'clock, and we're going to jump into talking about our assignment and our small groups and kind of getting all set up to work in groups. So if there's not any questions, we'll pause here and come back. Thank you.